My guests, and the topic this morning is the state and religion, the place of religion in governance. And with me already in studio, we have Surendra Bhatia, National General Secretary, Hindu Council of Kenya. Good morning. Just your reactions to, the autopsies are continuing in Shakahola following the unearthing of over 100 bodies there. Some suffocated, some strangled based on the autopsy results that are already out, but it is an exercise that is in progress. These deaths have been blamed on a religious leader, but just generally, what are your thoughts, your response to the events there?
One of the most unfortunate incidents which has occurred. I mean, God has created us for living and not for giving up the life. And if there are any religious leaders who have taken people the other way around, then their credentials have to be definitely doubted. The religious leaders have a function to play, a function in this society, and that is to build up the society and not the other way around. And what's happened is exactly the other way around. So from a religious perspective, what has happened is condemnable. It's very unfortunate. We stand in prayers with the families of all those who have lost their lives in this.
All right. We also have, as I mentioned, joining us virtually, Professor John Osogo Ambani, Dean of Law, Kabarak University. Good morning, Professor. I see you on my screen. I hope you've had a good start to the day. Just to get your reactions to the Shakahola tragedy.
Yeah, good morning, Olive. Happy to be here this morning with you and the rest of the Kenyans. I join my brother in condemning the occurrences in Shakahola. They are obviously regrettable, they are sad, backward, and something that we must look into. The worst part for me, of course, was to see children who could not take a decision of their own, suffering this kind of violence orchestrated by a person that they should trust. Because church leaders would often occupy a position of respect or honor, a position of leadership, where others naturally follow. And I think children led by their parents would obviously walk into this religious organization, hoping that their lives would be better, only to end up where they ended. That is very sad. The other one, of course, is to look at the attacks that this is likely to focus on religious groups. Most of which are actually genuine, going on with the normal habit of obeying their God, worshipping, giving thanks, and all those good things. And now they're likely to go spotlight both by police and even members of the public, which is not a very good thing, looking at the way society depends on religion for its own well-being. I think that would be my immediate reaction to the question.
All right, and I should have said, yeah, reaction, not reactions. I apologize to those who are sticklers of grammar, but I did mention that we would be joined shortly by Hassan Olenado, the National Chairman, Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. What has been your reaction to this tragedy? Post-mortem has begun. It shows that signs of starvation, but also suffocation and strangulation in some cases, especially where children are concerned.
Thank you for having us in this conversation this morning. It's really very, very unfortunate that an institution of worship, a religious organization, can do what has actually happened. And sometimes you want to wish it out. You want actually to say, I wish it is not true. But it is true because that happened. We have lost lives. People are there lining up, asking looking for their disappeared kin. And to us as Muslims, we are seeing a situation where the reaction to what had happened is much or less not as it was like when we faced almost similar situations ourselves as a community, where we have some few young men and women who are recruited and joined terror organizations. The reaction and the persecution of the Muslim community was so huge to an extent that anyone who is actually wearing a kansu with a beard and whatever was seen as a suspected terrorist. I'm not saying it should happen equally like what happened to us, but it's a lesson that we should learn as a country and as a people, that some of these things can happen to everybody, irrespective of the faith that we subscribe to, irrespective of the communities that we belong to. And so when we are talking about the measures, the countermeasures of such situations, we should not be looking at, we don't need to be judgmental, looking at others as these are worse, and then we have others whom can actually be tolerated in the society. I want to see this country reacting the same way and actually putting the same measures that we suffered as a community. Because during the times of the late Abu Drog and other things that happened, mosques were closed. There were a number of mosques that were closed in this country. There are a number of individuals who are put under surveillance and other things. And we are not seeing the same happening now. And we are even seeing people talking about, let us not be judgmental, let us judge. And that is exactly what we have been crying for in this country, that let us not be judgmental. Let these issues, let these concerns be issues that can actually be addressed or associated with an individual or a particular organization, but not the whole faith. I still appeal to the Kenyan people that as much as this had happened, and this is where we are at the moment, we should not really blackmail the Christian faith that it is Christianity that is doing this. I think it is just better we look at it from how it is and who is involved, and we just call it by the name, than actually condemning the whole community holistically.
I'm trying to find a retweet of yours, because your message is actually consistent with something you tweeted, where the First Lady had talked to, the Second Lady, wife to Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, had said this is a criminal element. You cannot use it to blanket condemn the Christian community or religious leaders in general. So I'm listening to you now, and I see that you stand by that.
Absolutely, yes. All
right. Okay, so this conversation, of course, at least today's conversation, was triggered or has been triggered by the events in Shakahola. And opposition leader, let me just call him Azimio leader, Raila Odinga, because he contests the legitimacy of the sitting president. But he raised the question again on the relationship between state and religion. Let's take a look at what the Constitution provides, shall we? Because it's something that even President William Ruto referenced when he took part in iftar at a certain point in State House. So he referenced the preamble to the Constitution, which at the very start says, "We, the people of Kenya, acknowledging the supremacy of the Almighty God of all creation." So that is how our Constitution starts, just like our national anthem, "O God of all creation." And when I scroll down now to Article 8 of the Constitution, it provides this, and I quote, "State and religion," a very succinct sentence, "there shall be no state religion." All right. So these are the provisions I have had time to look at. I'm not a legal expert, but we do have one with us who's joined virtually. But before I get his take on this, the Hindu Council is the Hindu Council of Kenya is part of the Interreligious Council of Kenya.
True.
And the Interreligious Council of Kenya plays a role even where the constitution of the selection panel with regard to offices such as that of IEBC commissioner is concerned. Is he the chairman? Yes, the chairman of the Interreligious Council the last time took part. So it's included in when we're undertaking such decisions. The current chairman of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, Bishop David Oginde. So there's a role that we see religious leaders play in the governance of the country. But what's your take on the subject? What is the place, in your view, of religion as far as governance is concerned?
So, Hindu Council of Kenya is a non-political organization, and therefore our views are independent and do not endorse any political party liking or disliking. Now, our views on this is very simple. Every society have different kind of leaders. We have social leaders, we have religious leaders, we have got political leaders, we have got state leaders. Each of them has got a definitive role to play in building up the society. Religious leaders have a role to build up individuals so that they can contribute to the development of the country. The governance leaders and the political leaders have a responsibility to ensure that the welfare of the people is taken care of. Now, these are two different roles. They have to follow different paths, and therefore they do not mix. So in our mind, the religious leaders have a role to play, that is to build up the society. Now, when we take part in the governance structures, whether it is IEBC or any other government structure, it is not with a view of a political influence. The view is to build up those institutions so those institutions can be strong pillars for the development of our country. Similarly, we expect that the state leaders will take up as their responsibility to ensure the welfare of their country. In our mind, these are two different paths and do not mix.
Okay, interesting. I'll get your views on the subject, Hassan Olenado. But let's hear from Professor John Osogo Ambani. Professor, what do you make of the fact that at the very start of our Constitution, it reads that we acknowledge, let me just find it again, but it reads, it's the very first thing, we acknowledge the supremacy of the Almighty God of all creation. What does it say to you, even given that our national anthem starts with, O God of all creation?
Yes, Olive. If one looks at the Constitution and isolates particular articles, my take is that they would get lost. Because looking at, say, the preamble paragraph we just read, which is actually the first main one, they're talking about people acknowledging the supremacy of Almighty God. We're also talking at the end, God bless Kenya, if you know. So we appear to be talking about a sovereign God, appear to be talking about one God, if you go literally like that, and then who is capable of blessing. You hearing all those things. It can't be applicable, say, to people who are polytheist or polytheistic, people who say believe or worship more than one God. They would think they're out of place. Or people who think they have no God or no particular God, perhaps hills and mountains be their gods. They would feel that that constitution doesn't represent them. And then you go to Article 8, and then the constitution says that it doesn't have a state religion. You see? You move to Article 27, and then you find that the Constitution says we are all equal, and that means that everyone, regardless of their religious formation or their religious civilization or conversion, is actually equal to the other. But it gets even more confusing. You go to Article 32 of the Constitution, and you find there that we have religious liberty, all of us. Not only to have a conscience, a religious belief, but also to practice and manifest our particular religions freely and openly. And that nobody can, in fact, compel us into one religion or the other. If you read that, and again, say, look at Article 170, which provides for candidates, I think you would be confused at that level already, if you are, say, a lay person looking at the Constitution. So my sense is that that is not the way to go, but rather to reconcile these provisions to make sense as a people of Kenya. And I've always had frameworks that can help to do this. One of them is to look at ourselves as people of different civilizations. If you studied our people very well, you'll notice that most of us are traditional Africans who are either born that way, have been socialized that way. And in the course of this, we have also met with new friends. Usually visitors that came much later. For instance, the Arabs and their Islam. And they spread their civilization, beginning, of course, at the coast all the way to inside the country, in the hinterlands. And then we had other visitors that came in the form of missionaries, and also government officials that came during the colonial epoch, that began to spread their faith and their values, the Christian values. We also had other friends from India, especially, now even India, Pakistan, but who came also with their own religions, Hindu religion, Islamic religion, and and so forth and so on. And increasingly, even Chinese people have been coming and joining us, and many other civilizations are now with us. So Kenya cannot be about one religion that thinks in one way. So a proper reconciliation has to take care of all this. And I think it's always good to look at this reconciliation at three levels. One, this provides for the liberties of all these religious formations. And by religious formations, I also include those who have no religion, those who are atheists, agnostics, and the like. And then you also have to treat them equally, to look at each religion as a religion that is one, that has its own dignity, that has its own respect and honor, and that is important to the people that believe in it. And then finally, the third level would be to look at all these as a rainbow nation, to look at Kenya as one entity in which all of us must thrive. So religious rainbow of some sort is what I'm talking about here, where maybe as President William Ruto goes out to market our country or to speak about our people, we should be able to proudly speak about a united people called Kenyans, but who are very different in terms of what they believe in or even not believe in the first place. I think that would be the best way to reconcile those conditions. Otherwise, you hit different obstacles at all levels. I hope that begins the conversation.
All right. He's gotten us a little bit, Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, into history. And you are the historian in the building, Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, Senior Lecturer in Chair Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi. But before we get into the history, because yesterday when we were speaking on phone, you were telling me how in the colonial era the flag followed the cross. Does Kenya, in your view, fall in the strict definition of a secular state?
Ideally, I mean, in theory, yes. In practice, our history basically says something else. But generally, when you look at, if we may specifically look at Kenya's post-colony, we have had a situation where we have oscillated between a political system that co-opts religion and one that has some level of ambivalence with the religion. Let me probably begin with where we started in the 60s. I could go further to the colonial period that you said about. Probably we can reserve that for later. We begin with Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's administration, which I usually call Kenyatta 1. And Mzee belonged to a crop of African politicians who had chosen to, at some point in their life, to remain ambivalent to matters religious. Kenyatta, as a young boy, he actually joined the Church of Scotland in Togoto today, which we call the Presbyterian Church. And that's why he was baptized Johnston Kamau Wangengi, I think way back in 1914, if my memory serves me well. Then he grows up, and there emerges some slight differences between the way he looked at his life and the way the missionaries wanted. So he parted ways with the missionaries. Fast forward, he goes to London and acquires a very Pan-Africanist way of looking at things that started questioning the role of Western Christianity in the colonization of Africa. And then they start really going traditional, and that's the time he writes the famous Facing Mount Kenya, published, I think, first in 1938. And it is at that point that he drops his Christian, so-called Christian name, Johnston, and with the help of his close friend Mbio Koinange, he names himself Jomo Kenyatta, which we are told was actually a nickname at some stage in his life. So for Kenyatta's attitude towards religion as a nationalist before independence was one of constant questioning of the role of Western religion in the colonization of Africa. And he tends more to go to the traditional and cultural way of doing things. And many leaders actually followed this trend. They dropped their Christian name. Jaramogi dropped Adonija and he became Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. President Kibaki, they could be President Kibaki, dropped Emilio and became Mwai Kibaki. And that trend gets even to the 70s, when we see our own scholars, James Ngui wa Thiong'o, dropping James and becoming just Ngui wa Thiong'o. So Kenyatta was a laid-back African statesman who respected religion, but hardly got into the mixing of Western thinking of religious philosophy into his political administration. Moi provides a contrast, and a big one for that matter. A product of the Christian missionaries, particularly the African Inland Church. A devout young Christian man who actually grows up and gets an education thanks to the role of the Christian mission. And interestingly, he is baptized and named Daniel. I'm sure with the inspiration of Daniel of the Old in the biblical scriptures. And then he rises up as a politician, and in his way of operation, religion played a very important role. As he deputizes Kenyatta, he found himself in a very awkward situation where the political elites from Kenyatta's backyard didn't think that he was worth to succeed Mzee when it was increasingly becoming clear that Mzee was becoming weak and he will actually leave by way of natural attrition anytime. So Moi increasingly, I think when you look at his life and some of the people who have written about it, increasingly becomes Christian as a way of seeking refuge and comfort because of the persecutions that he goes through on the hands of the elites around Kenyatta's administration. Okay. Well, fast forward, then he becomes president.
Okay. And I'll pause you there because we need to take a break. But we'll come back with that because it raises an issue for me. You said he sought comfort from the church as a way of not really addressing, but from the persecution.
Yes, of course. That becomes very clear in his life and operations.
Okay. Yes. So can we then draw parallels between him and the current sitting president, William Ruto? And we'll come back with that on the other side. And my question for Hassan Ole Nado is whether he agrees with Surendra Bhatia that the two, politics and religion, do not mix, or are there instances where they do? More on that on the other side of this break. All right, welcome back to AM Live, and now I have a full panel. I was getting a little bit worried, Dr. Wakanda, but he is here, and I'm curious what he makes of the statement that was made by Raila Odinga on, was it on Monday? Yes, it was. And he said, going forward, he didn't say President William Ruto, I'm just filling in the blanks, but Ruto must commit to draw a clear line between religion and state in this country. He has deliberately merged the two to enable his political survival, and he claims cover up for his corruption. And I had asked the question, can there, because we got a bit of a history lesson. We looked at Kenyatta 1, and we were looking at MO1, as some called him, Daniel Torre, teacher Arap Moi, and the comfort he sought from the church, and his church was the African Inland Church, from prosecution. From persecution, I beg your pardon. But Hassan Ole Nado, your views, do the two mix, politics and religion?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that we must appreciate as Kenyans Kenya is a highly religious country. And some of us may not know when really to display or to demonstrate that religiosity and when not. Because what essentially the Constitution envisages a situation where a person in the office of the top leadership should actually not display is religiosity when he's discharging his duties, so that there should be that kind of separation. The challenges that we have, sometimes we may not even know where is the boundary between the belief system, the beliefs that I believe as an individual and as the holder of the office. And that is where we may actually end up having a mix. But being religious is a good thing. But how to conduct your affairs at the public and in leadership is also something different. And we will not want to see a situation where we actually have the mix, because if we have the mix, then we are actually getting into trouble. We have had more troubles in this country. The trouble of ethnicity that have refused to go away. We cannot afford to bring at this point another problem on top of what we have not been able to solve. We cannot afford to bring the religious question in the middle or in the mix of politics and governance in our country. I think the framers of our constitution were actually aware of where we are as a country, and that is why they spoke of the separation. But being a leader, it is good to be religious, but how the boundary now should be what we should be discussing. At what level? Do we have to have it as personal life, which will be of course private and not public? And how do we do this? And I want to see, for example, if I was on political leadership, really, when they go to the church, they just go to the church as common people, as a commoner who is going to worship his God. They should not go to the church or to the mosque with that kind of, that can have portraying that is actually there as the leader of the country. But he should go there as a believer or that particular institution, but not necessarily, so that we avoid a scenario where we can actually be made to believe that this church or this grouping is one and the same with this particular one. Yeah.
The church, Dr. Makanda, we're joined by Dr. Nelson Makanda, and if you haven't been introduced, he's the General Secretary, Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. Now, the church has come under increasing scrutiny, not just following the Shakahola tragedy, but prior to that, with this particular election. Accusations were made by Azimio against, for example, Jackson Ole Sapit. And there are those even to this day who take issue with something that has been raised by Hassan Olenado, which is the use of the pulpit to politic. What is your position on the subject?
Thank you very much, Olive. And thank you for the privilege for us to discuss this subject and to engage. I associate myself with most of the comments that have been made here. I was listening to Prof. rehearse Kenyan history, but perhaps part of that history is he should tell us the clear role that the church played in the independence of this country. The first defender of the Kenyan people against the colonial master was actually the church. The Devonshire White Paper that spoke about when the rights of the African, the Asian, and the white conflict on the right to own land in Kenya. That was 1922-24. The Devonshire paper put out and said the priority and preference will be given to the Africans. And who drafted that paper? It was the clergy. I mean, Bishop and others. It was the missionaries writing that paper as an advisory to the British Parliament to say, where there is conflict on the right to own land in Kenya, priority must be given to the Africans. And so the role of the church in this country, in the formation of this nation, it's at the core. I mean, the church is at the core of the history of this country. And so religion and this country are intertwined. And so the discussion about separation of religion and state, as you read out in the Constitution, was more to say that the state shall not favor one religion against the other. But that Constitution, as you rightly read it, it's a more polytheistic a constitution than a constitution that says God should not be worshipped. I mean, there's lots of expression of God in the Kenyan Constitution. The only thing that the Constitution does is to say the state shall not favor one religion against the other. And so in the conduct of its affairs, then the state must know that we have people of all religions. You have Christians, you have Muslims, you have Hindus, but in Kenya you also have other religions. You have Jews, people who practice Judaism. You also have African traditionalists. All that conglomeration will form part of this state, a rainbow as it were. Coming to your specific question about the role of the church, allow me to say that our political leaders have liberty to worship in a place that they choose to worship. And nobody can stop them from making their expression, because the freedom of conscience and expression, religion and belief in this country is enshrined in the Constitution. And so we cannot take away rights from one leader and give rights to another. I mean, this Sunday, the Honorable Kalonzo and Mother Karua were being prayed for by my clergy here in Imara Daima. They attended church. Then later on in the day, I see a news article with what you are reading. The Honorable Raila Odinga is saying, let's condemn so-and-so. But yet, his own entourage, they have spent the whole morning in church. They were prayed for. They were dedicated and prayed for. As you go out there like Daniel, like David, go and fight. So I think it is more trying to argue when it favors you, it's fine. When it does not favor you, it's not okay. So I think let's not get to that space where we want to start to involve religion and the church in the battle of the two protagonists, the president and the Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga. I think let's just focus and say the issues that one is raising up against the other, let's deal with those issues. Let's not bring in religion, because if you bring in religion in that mix, he will not win. None of them shall win. Religion in this country is so deep. It's so deep. That's why you find people being confused in Shakahola just by somebody who is actually a criminal, but masquerading as a religious leader. He's confusing people. So let's not bring religion in this discussion between the two. Let's more focus on the fact that religion has a place to play in the Kenyan state, this country, education, healthcare, agriculture, polytechnics were all institutions of the church before the state. The state has been invited. Actually, the state is a newcomer in education in Kenya, in healthcare in Kenya, in agriculture, in polytechnics. All of them, if you read the history of this country, are institutions that were founded and brought here by religion. And so we are enjoying the benefits of religion. So we cannot say, let's put religion at the back end, then let's do our statocracy. I think in Kenya, as Kenya is constructed, it's not going to be possible.
And I'm glad we have that picture on the screen, because just a reminder that we do have Professor John Osogo Ambani as part of this panel. He's just joining us virtually. He's the Dean of Law, Kabarak University. And on what you have raised, I will give Hassan Olenado an occasion to respond. But before then, Surendra, there's something, we are told Kenya is what, 85% Christian. Not now, if you add on the other religions, we are a faithful nation, so to put, right? But we still wrestle with things such as corruption, ethnicity. What is that an indication of? Is it an indication that our religious leaders, our religious institutions have failed?
So, not really. I wouldn't say they have failed. You know, as I mentioned a little while earlier, each leader has a different role to play in building up our country, right? Being religious is very different from religion and state being together, right? I just referred to the example which was taken by my brother from the university, that President Moi used to find comfort through the church. Now, that's exactly what I'm saying. The president is an individual as well as a leader. The state there was building up him into a strong individual. That is why he was finding comfort. That did not mean that the church was interfering in the matters of the state. Now, these are two different things together. Religious leaders have got a role to play to build up strong individuals, strong institutions, as my brother also said, strong churches, strong hospitals, strong schools, etc. Now, each one of us have got a definite role to play. And it's only when we play our definitive roles is that when this country will develop and reach its potential. Religious leaders have also got a role to build in the values of life and the way of life into every individual. Maybe that progress is a little slow. That's why we are still battling with ethnicity and other issues. But then that is a role which is being played by the religious leaders. And that's a role which should be played by the religious leaders so that we can accelerate our growth and take away these small things which actually become hindrance in the progress of this country.
All right. Professor, sorry, had you concluded your point? Yeah. I didn't mean to cut you short. But Professor Ombongi, there's something that has been raised by Dr. Makanda here, and that is the church is heavily invested in the area of education. It is heavily invested in the area of health, for instance, right? And if we're talking governance, those are core. Those are core issues that even this administration has addressed itself to. And I borrow a terminology that has been bandied about a lot lately. They are stakeholders in this country. So, can there truly be a line, in Kenya's case, between state and religion?
Yeah, but I'm not sure there's a country that can make a clear line between religion and state. Because religion is key, is a natural part of a human being. I think it's clear that many human beings aspire to something higher than themselves, which is usually God, deity, an entity beyond them, and religion would play that kind of role. It's also been clearly stated that religion actually comforts. It humbles down, it brings down emotions, bad feelings. It actually brings positive energy, if you like, and it's really part and parcel of humanity and something that we can't wish away just like that. But before I come back to your question, I want to state that there has been a conflation or confusion between secular state and eliminating religion from the public space. That confusion arises because many people have been looking at northern countries to define ourselves. They look mostly at the US, they look at Turkey, they look at France, in defining our religious experience. Whenever you look up there, you get lost for two reasons. One, that those same people are the ones that colonized us. Okay? And when they did colonize us, they introduced religious states, strong religions, like missionaries and all that kind of thing. At the same time, in fact, around the time they were beginning to colonize us, they were actually stopping that kind of practice. They were moving, after going through a number of revolutions there, reformations, you heard about that, Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and all those kind of things. They were moving to something else, now what we call globalization and all that, where religion wasn't very important to them. So we are looking to them now with the lenses of yesterday, and every time we do that, we get lost. The true reality is that religion remains key part and parcel of our people, and our people should remain free to exercise religion whichever way they want. I want to agree with Dr. Makanda that religion has played a key role in emancipating this country. From the freedom movement, whether it's traditional religion, Elijah Masite, to the Christian missionaries, and that continued even in the independence era. When we fought, for example, for multi-party democracy, you remember people like Reverend Timothy Joya, Archbishop Gitari, remember people, serious, clergy, but even also Islamic clergy taking part in this. Traditional leaders have always taken part in these things, whether it's by telling people you will not receive the bullets, actually the Holy Spirit will break the bullets for you, so go and fight and all that. Spiritual values have been very useful in liberating us, and we can't wish that away. You can't say religion is going to help us to fight for a new state, and then when the state comes, we tell them to disappear. I think that would be eating too much from the same plate. So, to the question you asked, has religion a role in the governance of this nation? And the answer is yes. I've always said to myself that if the Catholic Church stopped its educational mandate, the education system will move into a crisis immediately. Kenya has no capacity to run the education sector without it. Probably one of us here has children in a Catholic school. The universities in Kenya are predominantly religion outside the state-run universities. In the health sector, if you are sick anywhere in this country, you're very most likely going to go to a missionary hospital, to foundation, for example, the Aga Khan, for example, the ones in Parklands. It is very rare that ordinary Kenyans will come together outside government form, to serve any purpose or provide any service outside the religious groupings. So religion then becomes a very good organizer that every serious government will then tap into, to ensure that the people have the services that they require. And so we can't say religion go in one go. And I want to mention that the Constitution recognizes the role of religion quite intensely, beginning with even the commencement of leadership. What happens when you're taking up a leadership position? You take an oath. And Kenyan oath is an oath of affirmation. And the oath is a religious one. Hold a religious book and say, I'm going to perform this duty, so help me God. And the idea behind that is also tap into the value of religion in enforcing our own fidelity to the law, fidelity to the good values that the Constitution then upholds, and so forth and so on. We've seen national prayers. We can start national prayers, national forums of prayer. So you'll have prayers at the beginning of Jamhuri. Many times you'll see perhaps a master elder praying, Turkana elder praying, a Christian, maybe Anglican, maybe a Muslim. And all this is because the state plans around this kind of ideas. So I think Kenyans should disabuse themselves of what they probably heard from France, that religion is a bad thing or that it should be eliminated from the public space, for the sake of something else. What I can only add here, though, is that as we exercise our religions, as we practice them, let us remember the three things I alluded to earlier. Try to be free, allow everyone to be free. Try to treat each and everyone equally, whether you're present or not. And then also just to look at ourselves as an identity of everyone, whether one has 55% and the others are 10. I think it's just good to start looking at ourselves as this montage. I always say a montage, a collage, or a rainbow, if you go to South African language, rainbow of sorts. And I think all colors of the rainbow matter. None of them is more special than the others. I think I could stop there unless you have further question in this issue.
No, I'll come back to you. But then we've primarily looked at the role of religion in state affairs. But the other way around, and this has been raised by the Shakahola tragedy, and you also addressed yourself to it, Hassan Olenado, the role of state in religion. But and we'll get into that. But before then, Dr. Ombongi, I asked a question: are there parallels to be drawn between MO1 and the current administration? And I ask that because you talked about comfort and persecution, and the sitting president in the run-up to the 2022 presidential election painted himself as a man who was persecuted by former President Uhuru Kenyatta's administration. And staying with the same, if I continue to read the statement that was made by Raila Odinga on Monday, he took issue with the Faith Diplomacy Office being established in State House, and he made reference to a claim that I've had a number of times, a list of 100 members to be recruited into the Public Service Commission as intercessors. But this aside, are there parallels that can be drawn?
Thank you all. I can answer that question if I continued with my line of thought, which you cut short earlier, where I was saying that the mantra of the separation of the church and the state, religion and the state, is actually more theoretical than practical if you looked at our history much more critically. And I was going through giving you an example of Kenyatta and Moi, and reached a point where I was saying that religion played an important role in political mobilization in Moi's time, just beyond being a place of comfort for him, as it were. But the Moi administration came in with another very interesting contradiction, that once he had actually strangled all the opposition to his administration, it was the church that became the opposition leaders to his administration. If you remember the days of, I think Professor Mbani mentioned Bishop Gitari, and his fiery summons. Bishop Unjoya is still around with us, and his very fiery criticism against the Moi administration. Bishop Alexander Muge. There was Bishop Ndingi Mwananzeki in his time in Nakuru. So there is that paradox. Then comes in Kibaki. Kibaki, in matters religious, was more or less a replica of Kenyatta I. Sit back, separate religion and the state, and make it a private practice to go to church occasionally, but also have your glass of wine or something occasionally and be happy. Now, when you come to Kenyatta II or Uhuru, was a blend of Moi and his father. But fast forward, President Ruto is actually a child of Moi, politically speaking, in many senses. We cannot rule out the fact that there are aspects that he's his own man, but we can also appreciate the fact that he is basically a scion of the Moi administration. They made him in the early 90s. And when you look at the script he seems to be actually using, is basically using religion as a very important tool of political mobilization. And he has exploited that to the maximum. Just like Moi, he comes to power from a point of weakness. We talked about persecution. President Ruto faces a situation where he actually fell off with his boss, President Kenyatta. And then he took a dimension where he decided to take the image of a David against Goliath, the biblical story of David, the diminutive David and the giant Goliath. And he made the best use, give it to him. He made the best use of mainly evangelical Christianity in convincing the country that as an underdog, he could rise to be what he is today. So you clearly see those parallels between the Moi administration and what we have seen of President Ruto in the few months that he has been in power. Whether it will continue like that is a question that we need to ask ourselves very critically in the face of Shakahola, in the case of what we are seeing religion has actually done in the space of the lives of ordinary Kenyans, which is a very interesting experience. Although not the first one in the country, not the first one in Africa, not the first one in the world, but it's something that we need to begin thinking about what religious fundamentalism, fanaticism can do. And always, every time we have a very close relationship between religion and the state, then history is replete with examples of how things go wrong. Because in its very nature, religious traditions are very subjective. Because what I believe in is not what he believes in. I bring to the public space what I believe in, he brings to the public space what he believes in, then there is a tendency to clash. The thing we need to do is probably separate our religious lives, our religious beliefs, our religious traditions from the practices of governance and the politics of the nation, because religious traditions by their very nature, by their very innate nature, are actually divisive. Because the theologies of different religions differ even on how to organize the state. So the moment we begin to bring that, therefore, then we are likely to conflict among ourselves.
Okay.
If you allow me a minute, I will reinforce the comment he made earlier about the role of religion throughout the history of Kenya. Yes, you look at the role of different denominations in the provision of education, in the provision of healthcare, in the provision of basically socio amenities and social provisions. Religious institutions have no challenge in that. But then we need also to appreciate the role particularly religion played in colonial Kenya. He referred to the Devonshire Paper of 1923, but my understanding of the Devonshire White Paper was a tool that was used by the colonial government to stem the rising influence of the Indians in Kenya then, because in the 1920s, the role of the Indians in Kenya, in Kenya's economy and Kenya's politics was rising to the extent that the colonial government, which was predominantly run by the British and the white minority group, was becoming uncomfortable. So the Devonshire White Paper then came in to present what one could see as a pretext of the paramount of African interest. But African interest then meant the interest of the British in actually Kenya, because in the three-tier system of the colonial society, the Africans were always at the bottom. Okay. So the competition between the local Indian community and the whites at the time in the 1920s was the one that gave birth to the Devonshire White Paper. It came as a way, because at the time, as one commentator said, Kenya was increasingly becoming America of the Hindu. So to say. So the Devonshire White Paper was a way the British used in order to stem the influence of the Indians, excluded them from the agrarian economy and many other areas, because that influence, the Kenyan law was Indian, the Kenyan justice system was Indian, the Kenyan currency was the Indian rupee at the time. So that is the competition that led to the Devonshire White Paper. But nevertheless, the church, if you look at colonial Kenya, its role was in the provision of social services. Right. But then it actually created an environment, softened their souls, in order to create the subservient subjects of the Queen at the time.
Okay, I see your fellow doctor smiling, laughing in fact. So we need to take another quick break. But when we come back, two questions for Hassan Olenado as well as for you, Dr. Makanda. And for Hassan, my question to you is something that has been raised by Dr. Ombongi, which is there are crimes, even if you look at Shakahola, atrocities that have been committed in the name of religion, historically. This is only the latest example. What is the state, as a Muslim community, you're saying you have lived through this, right, following the terrorist attacks. How have you navigated the role of the state in religion, right? What is your position on that? And also, Dr. Makanda, he talked about the dangers of mixing state and religion. The other day, Donald Kipkorir posted, I can't remember on which social media platform, and he said he went to State House and he asked for a glass of wine or something like that, and he was informed that the bar there had been dismantled. Is that indicative of intolerance? We come back with more on the other side of this break. All right, Dr. Ombongi, sorry. We're back with AM Live, and what we are discussing is this. The place of religion in governance. With me in studio I have Surendra Bhatia, National General Secretary, Hindu Council of Kenya, Dr. Nelson Makanda, General Secretary, Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, who we had from last, Senior Lecturer in Chair Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi, Professor John Osogo Ambani, Dean of Law, Kabarak University. He's joining us virtually, and Hassan Olenado, National Chairman, Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. Hassan Olenado, my question to you before we took the break was, because we've really looked at the role of religion where the state is concerned. Now, with the recent events that have transpired in Shakahola, again, we are having that conversation of the role of state where religion is concerned. What lessons have there been to learn in the Muslim community?
Thank you. Initially, when I started talking about this issue, I've really mentioned the challenges or the problems we have gone through as a community over time, since some of our own members also developed characteristics which are more or less similar to what we are just seeing, apart from the actually different that they were attacking instead of fasting to death, which of course to Muslims fasting to death cannot happen because we have a clear regulation over how we fast. So there is no way a Muslim can fast to death. Ours is quite very clear. And what I want to say is that there actually, in a country like ours, is that there are, as much as they should not be intertwined roles in between the state and the religious organizations, but in terms of regulatory capabilities, the state, we give ourselves to be regulated by the state. But most importantly, because any institution, when you talk about the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims, the Hindu Council of Kenya, the EAK and others, all of them are actually institutions that have been established by the Kenyan law. And therefore, we are in a way regulated by the state. But the most important regulation that I think we need to learn from the problems that we have gone through is self-regulation. It is very critical that we establish our own as religious institutions on how do we regulate ourselves. There are things the state will never do. And I remember during those days when we were talking about terrorism, we were saying, you cannot bomb an ideology. You cannot really use so much arsenal against an ideology. So ideology has to be countered by another ideology. So the state cannot in any way regulate the faith. But the faith themselves can regulate themselves. Because when we talk about regulation, and also it is very critical that we are actually talking about spirituality, which of course that is not an area of the state. It is an area of the faith community, because it is us who understands what is contained in our books. And therefore, how then do we know that certain group, certain person has actually gone outside the teachings of the holy books that we subscribe to? And therefore, it is only necessary that we look at ourselves and actually be able to regulate ourselves in a way that it provides accountability to the state. And therefore, there must be a relationship between the state and religious institutions, because in terms of regulatory kind of mechanisms where we think should actually be necessary. I am aware, of course, we all know that there was an attempt by the former Attorney General to give Muigai to introduce regulation, but he went a little bit extreme because he wanted to allocate a duty to government that cannot do. Because honestly, the government cannot, for example, have Islamic scholars to monitor Islamic content or what is actually being given out in mosques and madaris and other things. The government cannot do that. And you cannot be able to measure what is extreme, what is radical, if you don't subscribe to that particular faith. Because if you look at it from outside, then you will end up giving a very, very wrong kind of information. And I remember this. When we are dealing with the radicalization, there was a time even the word jihad was almost criminalized in the country. That when you get someone talking about jihad, then you raise the red flag. What is he talking about? Without knowing that jihad has much more meaning than the meaning that was being given by by people who doesn't understand Islam. So it is important that when you talk about how do we relate between the state and the religious institutions, it is basically, in my view, a kind of very close relationship where actually one need to look at what the other one is doing, but more importantly, in terms of the overall framework that provides internal regulations within the religious institutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Makanda, I asked him the question about the dismantling of a Bad State House, and he told me he drinks green tea, and I have not offered him green tea. Is that therefore intolerance? But aside from that, there's something we've seen talked about. Even that apparently we've been informed happened even when William Ruto was deputy president at Karen, and people would fast on Wednesday. We have now established a faith diplomacy office. There are claims of 100 intercessors being recruited. Does that not then infringe on the rights of others? If you want to fast, go ahead and fast, but that's a personal decision. Why should it be a policy at State House?
One, allow me to start by, you had earlier mentioned His Grace, the Archbishop Sapit.
Yes.
Its name, and it would be nice for me to speak to that, is that Bishop Sapit found himself on the floor of Bomas, not by choice, but that very afternoon we had prepared 7 prayers. There were going to be about 4 Christian prayers, 2 Muslim prayers, and 1 Hindu prayer before Chebukati announced the results. But out of the fracas that happened, things were not coordinated, and so Chebukati, out of his own will, decides to make a choice of somebody, and because Archbishop Sapit was putting on purple, he's tall, and I mean,
he was visible.
He was visible. I mean, he's a more visible Masai than Olenado here. So he was asked to come and pray. And so he did a function that either Olenado would have done, Archbishop Muheria would have done, or somebody else would have done. And so he made a brief comment and prayed before the results were announced. And so it's a victimization of His Grace that is undeserved at all. It was not a rehearsed thing. He didn't mean to pray alone on that afternoon. It's just that there had been a fracas, and things needed to move quickly, and so he came in and prayed, and he calmed the nation by his comments. And so I thought I needed just to say that, to clear the air. Archbishop, His Grace, was never partisan in the past elections, at least as far as I know.
All right.
Number 2 is to respond to your question and say that I'm not aware, because I'm not privy to the matter that you have raised, that there is a faith diplomacy office.
I can confirm.
You can confirm.
I can confirm.
And that the recruitment of intercessors. I'm also one.
That one I cannot confirm.
You cannot confirm. I'm also an intercessor.
That's intercessors I can't confirm.
I would like to be recruited. But however, I think the president and the presidency should be allowed latitude to express their faith if they feel and so think that they draw certain strength from their faith. They need to be given latitude to be able to manifest their faith, to the extent that they are not forcing Muslims to convert. They are not forcing Hindus to convert. They are not forcing African traditionalists to drop their faith and begin to practice their faith in the manner that they would like them to practice. So I think for me, we shouldn't. We are picking up trivial matters and bringing them to the table and beginning to focus on them as though they are critical. Because I mean, if the president wants people to pray for him, what's the problem? A statement that one wants people who can pray with him and for him as they execute their mandate, as long as in the execution of their mandate, they don't infringe on the rights of others to worship their God and to express their faith in the manner that they wish to express. I don't think that this should be a national matter for us to be discussing. I think we should give them latitude. Tomorrow, there will be a Catholic president or there will be a Muslim president, and they will worship in the manner that they choose to worship. So let's not push this ball too far. It's a matter of preference, and I would like to leave it there myself.
But is it Christian then? Because now I'll ask you as a
yes.
He has a PhD in biblical studies.
Yes, I do.
Is it Christian?
Yes.
And he was explaining it the last time that evangelicals subscribe to what is in Scripture.
Yes.
Not outside
Yes.
Scripture.
Yeah.
And he was very categorical that the Shakahola Church, not associated with the Evangelical Society of Kenya.
Yes.
Pastor Ezekiel's church, not associated with the Evangelical Society of Kenya.
Yes.
All right, just clarifying, now that we are providing clarification.
Yes.
And I remember last time I wasn't very clear about that. But is it Christian when faith is, I don't know whether to use the terminology, faith was politicized on the campaign trail, in this last campaign trail, right?
Yes.
Raila Odinga was demonized, quote, for not being faithful enough.
Yes.
President Uhuru Kenyatta, former president, then President Uhuru Kenyatta, was painted as this drunk. And there were reports that when this administration came into office, they cleansed or they prayed for, I don't know what the exercise exactly was, before they occupied State House. Is that Christian?
One, allow me to say that instrumentalization of religion by politics is something that we must be aware of. And it happens in almost all jurisdictions. The other day, the American politics, the Republicans versus the Democrats. The Republicans instrumentalize faith as it was. So this is not an exclusive matter that we can say it's only a Kenyan situation. If you go to Sudan, where the people are fighting now, they're instrumentalizing Islam, if you follow their arguments. So instrumentalization of religion in politics is something that we must be wary of at all times. And yes, politicians would like to take advantage and use as fodder religion, so that, especially where the majority are concerned, so that they win an election. But that in itself does not mean that religious leaders have abrogated their duties. I think we did our best to be able to advise our religious leaders to stay aloof and to be conscious that it's possible to be instrumentalized. And so in the run-up to the elections, you hear comments, so many comments thrown all over. It didn't begin this election. In 2007 election, there was an MOU between alleged MOU between the Honorable Raila Odinga and Muslims, and so you begin to hear instrumentality of religion in politics. I think what we must do, and religious leaders in this country, especially in the past 2 or 3 elections, have been very conscious of that fact. To stay together, and ask Hassan is here. We stayed together as religious leaders and ensured that our voice was not swallowed up, even though politicians went to congregations in different parts and had their gymnastics and what have you. If you review our commentary on the previous election, we all together, the Hindu, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Muslims, and the Christians, spoke with one voice against instrumentalization of religion in campaigns. And I think going forward, we need to pursue the same thread, we need to pursue the same behavior, but the smaller, finer details that you make reference to of the things that are happening in somebody's household. His Excellency the President has moved to State House as his home, with his children, with his wife, with his mother, and religion is part of their faith. It's their daily life. So if they are going to experience their daily life within the context of State House, then you cannot eliminate their faith, because faith is a matter of life, and on a daily basis they are practicing their faith. So on those finer details of how they domestically live within that compound, I think for me we should separate those issues. If they move that behavior to Harambee House, where the president has his official office, then let's begin to ask what is happening. But what happens at State House, or what happens at the DP's residence? Yes, it's an official residence constructed by the state for the officer, but it is where the family lives. You cannot tell the family, throw away your faith when you get into State House, you pick it when you leave State House. It will be 5 years or 10 years. What will they be after 10 years?
My issue is that they conduct business out of State House and out of the DP's residence. But I will pause there and stay with this question, the question of receiving of gifts. Has it compromised the moral authority of the church, particularly where you're concerned? But let me bring in...
We have declined gifts ourselves. I mean, I don't know whether, Hassan, you are with us in one of those events. I mean, we were given a gift and are told this is your fuel, use it as you, because you came to see us. I mean, we say no. We have our fuel paid for by our employers and our churches and our mosques, and so we have declined gifts before.
Okay. Surendra Bhatia, does the church bear, can you really sit back and say, you know, we can't get involved in politics? Because we've been given examples of Bishop Muge, Reverend Timothy Njoya, even Mutava Musimi. There's somebody else you mentioned.
Alexander Muge.
Okulu.
The Kamba Bishop?
Ndingi
Mwananzeki, yes, who spoke out against evil, right? So can religious leaders really sit back and say, you know, we are not getting involved? You people sort yourselves out.
I think it's in the best interest of the country and the society if the religious leader were to stick to their role to say that we will build up the institutions, we'll build up the individuals. I'm coming back to the same point again and again. I mean, there was an example when President Moi had actually vanquished the entire opposition, and that at that point of time the religious leaders played their role of bringing in the opposition institution as an institution to keep the checks and balances in a democratic society. So there is a responsibility which the religious leaders have, and that is to maintain balance in the society, to ensure that the institutions are strong, that our individuals are strong. You talked of the gifts. If the individuals are strong, the problem of gift goes away. We talked about the president having his own personal preferences as far as his religion is concerned. Now he's also an individual, and therefore by the constitution he has a right to practice his religion. And therefore, if he does it at his home, that's a personal matter, very different from a state matter, right? So from that perspective, I think the religious leaders have a role to play, that is of checks and balances, to ensure that the society and the country is moving in the right direction, that we are building up the institutions and the people in the right way. But for us to get involved in the politics of the country, as was told by my friends, the history of such examples worldwide is not really very pretty, and we should not get involved. We should stick to our roles, and we should ensure that the state does its role.
All right. I'll bring in Professor Ombongi at this point. Professor, does it infringe on the rights of others? For example, in State House, if we are told we fast on Wednesdays and we dismantle bars, does it infringe on the rights of others?
I don't know which others are these. Could it be the personnel at State House?
Yes, State House. The staff, yes.
Yeah, if you went to the Constitution and you're talking about Article 32, then you can't compel anyone into religion. So it's not clear to me whether the workers of the president's residents were forced to fast, or they did that voluntarily. If it was voluntarily, then it's a good thing, I think. I'm sure you're aware that as a team, you can decide that we are praying for something, and you come together and just pray for it. If there's no compulsion, then I don't see a problem with that. It's still within the constitutional framework. But if there was compulsion, then there would be a very serious problem. So I don't know what views you have on your end, but for me, that would be what the Constitution says.
All right. And Dr. Ombongi also wanted to weigh in?
Yes, Olive, I come from the academy, and let me just give a context into these ideas that we are discussing about what's happening in the State House. You see, in a traditional Machiavellic environment, always the prince, the prophet, and the philosopher go together. Machiavelli is an Italian political philosopher who thought that in politics, pragmatism is more important than anything else. And what we are seeing is actually that traditional approach to politics where the king, the priest, and the scholar go together. And what you are seeing, in my view, in State House is exactly that. And there could be another dimension that is not overemphasized. There are thinkers behind the throne, basically scholars who are thinking, philosophers who are thinking through what is happening. Where you have a situation like that one, you know, a prophet, a priest has to be around their religious rituals and all that in order to guide the prince, and in our case is as our president on the direction to go. So the fusion of these three is no surprise historically, really. You see it in many countries, many jurisdictions, and in many other areas. But what I think is prudent to do is not to overdo it, is to exercise some level of temperance, if you ask me, is to provide space for others also to exist and quote-unquote breathe. It is the question of living and letting others live. Because when you are dealing with a public space like State House, then overdoing certain things can actually bring very interesting perceptions to the public. And in politics, sometimes perception is everything.
Okay.
So I think that is very, very important.
All right, last word. Hassan Olenado, do you feel excluded, speaking personally, as a Muslim, by this administration, given some of their actions? And number two, have religious leaders lost their moral authority? For example, the reconstitution of IEBC, we have one of the camps saying the Interreligious Council of Kenya is compromised.
Yeah, let me begin with that. And I don't think actually there is, when somebody raises the question about being compromised, suggests that it is the representation of RCK that is being talked about. And in my view, the religious leaders have a responsibility, because we are all of us called upon that we command what is right and forbid what is evil. So anything that is wrong in our society, it is our responsibility to say this is wrong. And we have to say so without really fear or favor. It doesn't matter who has committed the wrong. We have to tell that person you are wrong. One important thing that we must also remind ourselves is that we don't have Kenyans who are the Kenyans of the state and the Kenyans of the religious people. They are the same people. They are the same people that politicians speak to. They are the same people the religious people on the days of worship speak to. So we are speaking to the same people. And therefore, anything that goes wrong in any way will affect each and every one of us at the same time. But I want to say that the role of the religious leaders is not exclusive in the sense that they cannot say anything political. The problem we are seeing today, which was not, which we have never experienced before, is that we are even today forgetting that the religious leaders have played critical role in the process in what many may call the second liberation, the issues of the constitution making processes and other things, until the 2010 constitution that we have, the constitution today, But today we have started a tradition of profiling religious leaders, just to deny them the space, and also to take away the respect that certain individuals have in this country. And because of suspicion that maybe this person is not supporting my candidature or my political inclination. And I think that is a very tricky thing to do. It is wrong to profile religious leaders and to make them look like whenever they speak, they are actually speaking for this particular group. In Kenya today, our politics have given us a kind of a new meaning to many things. There are things that when you speak about all the time, it means you are actually referring to a certain political grouping, and making it very difficult. When you want to speak, you really have to choose your words. Well, if you say this word, it's associated with this group, you say that word is associated with that group, and that is what is actually happening today. And I think Kenyans must resist. We must resist a situation where the religious leaders are deliberately profiled so that they are denied the space to guide the Kenyan people. Because to me, if we lose the religious leadership, then we have lost everything. Because this is now the only institution remaining to moderate our politics and to give us the voice of reason whenever we are stuck on political issues.